Chapter 6. Everybody in Highbury wanted to entertain Mr. and Mrs. Elton. Dinner parties and evening parties were arranged for them, and they had so many invitations that they rarely spent an evening at home. Emma knew they must have a dinner at Hartfield for them, or people might guess that she did not like Mrs. Elton. It was easy to decide who to invite. The Westons and Mr. Knightley, of course, but there must be an eighth person. This ought to be Harriet, but Emma was not surprised when she said she could not come, and she understood exactly why. Poor Harriet did not yet feel comfortable with the Eltons. So Emma was able to ask Jane Fairfax to be the eighth person at the dinner. She was glad she could do this, because Mr. Knightley's words had worried her. He had said that Jane spent time with Mrs. Elton only because no other person asked her. This is very true, thought Emma, and I am certainly guilty of it. I ought to have been a better friend, and I will try harder now. Everyone replied to her invitations and said they could come. And there was one other surprise guest. Isabella's two eldest boys were coming to stay at Hartfield, and Mr. John Knightley was bringing them on the day of the dinner party. So Emma had one extra guest until she lost another. Mr. Weston had to go to London on business and could not be there for the dinner, but he hoped to join them later in the evening. On the day of the party, everyone arrived on time. Mr. John Knightley and his sons had met Miss Fairfax that morning as they were walking home from Highbury, when it had just started raining. "I hope you did not get too wet this morning?" he asked Miss Fairfax, as they stood together in the drawing-room. "I only went to the post office," she replied. "I go every morning to fetch the letters." "When you have lived to my age, you will know that no letter is important enough to get wet for," he said. Mrs. Elton had been listening to the conversation. "What is this I hear? Going to the post office in the rain? You must not do it again," she said loudly. "I will not let you. I shall speak to Mr. E, and he will ask the man who fetches our letters to deliver yours too." Jane looked embarrassed. "You are very kind, but I enjoy the walk," she said. But Mrs. Elton would not listen. "My dear girl, say no more about it. It is already arranged," she said. "I really cannot agree to it. There is no need to make more work for your servant," replied Jane. Emma heard all this and wondered who might be writing to Jane, but she said nothing. Dinner was ready. Emma took Jane's arm, and they walked into the dining-room together, as if they were the best of friends. Later, soon after the gentlemen had joined the ladies in the drawing-room, Mr. Weston arrived. He had only just come home from London, and then walked to Hartfield. After he had spoken to all the guests, he gave his wife a letter which had been waiting at Randalls when he arrived there. "It's from Frank," he said, mostly to Mrs. Weston, although everyone in the room was listening. "And he's coming here next month. The Churchills are going to stay in Richmond for a few months, only 9 miles from here, so he can be with us very often. He says we must start planning the ball again." Mrs. Weston was very pleased, and Emma was a little surprised to feel so excited by the news. Her guests said they were looking forward to seeing Frank again. Mrs. Elton had never met him, but she still had something to say. "How delightful for him to come back to Highbury now there is a new neighbour to meet," she said. Emma thought about Frank after the party, and hoped that he might perhaps come back to Highbury less in love with her than before. She knew she must look carefully to see if this was true. Then she could decide how to behave. She did not have to wait long. As soon as the Churchills arrived in Richmond, Frank rode to Highbury for the day. He was certainly very pleased to see Emma, but she was sure he loved her less. He was as happy to talk and laugh as always, but after only 15 minutes at Hartfield, he hurried away to see other friends in Highbury. This was his only visit for 10 days. Although he wrote to Mrs. Weston and said they must now decide on a date for the ball, and he would certainly be there. The day of the ball came. Emma and Harriet travelled together to the Crown Inn, and arrived just after the group from Randalls. Frank was obviously happy to be with Emma again, but he spent a lot of time walking to the door and back, and listening for the sound of other carriages. Soon some friends of Mr. Weston's arrived. Then Mr. and Mrs. Elton. Somebody said it was raining, and Frank immediately went to look for umbrellas. "We must not forget Miss Bates," he said. "I will see that she does not get wet." And he went to the door and waited there. He soon came back with Miss Bates and Jane Fairfax. "So very kind," said Miss Bates. "Not enough rain to worry about, but we must think of Jane, of course. Well—" She stopped as she saw into the ballroom. "Well, this is certainly brilliant. An excellent room, now that we have these wonderful lights." When everyone had arrived, Mr. Weston and Mrs. Elton led them forward for the first dance. Emma was delighted to see so many people dancing, and knew she was going to enjoy the evening. But she was sad to see that Mr. Knightley did not dance. He stood with some of the older men and looked quite serious, except when Emma caught his eye, and then he smiled at her. She thought it was a pity he did not like either dancing or Frank Churchill a little better. The last 2 dances before dinner had almost started, and Harriet had no partner. She was the only young lady sitting down. Until then, the numbers had been equal, and Emma could not understand what had happened. But then she saw Mr. Elton walking about. He would not ask Harriet if he did not have to, and Emma thought he might suddenly escape into the card room. But she was wrong. Mr. Elton stood in front of the place where Harriet was sitting, and talked to other people, but he did not even look at her. Emma was quite near, and when Mrs. Weston came and spoke to him, she heard every word. "You are not dancing, Mr. Elton?" she asked. "I certainly will if you will dance with me." "Me? Oh, no. I was thinking of a better partner for you." "Ah, Mrs. Gilbert. Well, I am an old married man now, and my dancing days are almost over, but I will be happy to dance with her," he said. "Mrs. Gilbert does not dance, but there is a certain young lady. Miss Smith is not dancing," Mrs. Weston explained. "Miss Smith," he said. "I did not see her. If only I were not an old married man. But I must be excused, Mrs. Weston. I'm afraid my dancing days are over." Mrs. Weston said no more, and Emma felt angry and upset for Harriet. She saw Mr. Elton walk away, and watched him and his wife smile at each other. The next time Emma looked, she saw a happier sight, as Mr. Knightley led Harriet to the dance. Emma felt very grateful to Mr. Knightley, and when she looked for Mr. Elton, she saw him going into the card room, and hoped he felt foolish. Emma did not have an opportunity to talk to Mr. Knightley until after dinner. "They wanted to hurt both you and Harriet," he said. "Why are they your enemies?" "They cannot forgive me because I wanted Mr. Elton to marry Harriet," she replied. "You were right about Mr. Elton. I made a serious mistake," she said. "I think he has made a bigger one," he replied. "Harriet has some excellent qualities, and she is very pleasant and easy to talk to, unlike Mrs. Elton." At that moment, Mrs. Weston called them in to start the dancing again. "Come, Emma, they are all lazy. You must start." "Who is your partner?" Mr. Knightley asked Emma. "You, if you will ask me," she replied. "We are not exactly brother and sister after all." "Brother and sister? Certainly not," he said, and they walked into the ballroom together. Chapter 7. Dancing with Mr. Knightley was one of Emma's favourite memories of the ball. She was also glad they both thought the same of Mr. and Mrs. Elton and their insult to Harriet. It seemed as if Harriet's eyes had suddenly opened at the ball, and she now saw Mr. Elton differently. Emma walked in the garden the morning after the ball, and decided it would be a happy summer. Harriet out of love, Frank not too much in love, and Mr. Knightley not arguing with her. Frank was not going to call at Hartfield that morning, because he had to go straight back to Richmond. So, as Emma was just going back into the house, she was very surprised to see him coming through the gates, with Harriet. Harriet looked white and frightened, and he was obviously trying to calm her. Soon they were all in the house, and Harriet immediately fainted. Emma fetched some water, and slowly Harriet became a little better, and was able to tell her story. She had been out with a friend, and they were walking along the Richmond road, when they suddenly met a group of gypsies. A child asked the girls for money, and they were both very frightened. Harriet's friend ran away, but before Harriet could follow her, more gypsy children arrived and were all round her. She thought if she gave them some money, they would go away. But the opposite happened, and suddenly she was surrounded by a lot of gypsies. At that moment, Frank came along the road on his way back to Richmond. He saw what was happening, saved her, and brought her to Hartfield. When he was sure Harriet felt better, he continued on his journey home. In half an hour, the news was all over Highbury, and everyone heard what had happened. Mr. Knightley went with some other men to find the gypsies, but they had already gone. The story soon became unimportant, but Emma remembered how worried Frank had been about Harriet, and how she had held onto his arm. She began to have stronger hopes for them both. About a fortnight later, Emma and Harriet were talking together, and Emma said something about people getting married. To her surprise, Harriet replied, "I shall never marry." "I hope this is nothing to do with Mr. Elton," replied Emma, and Harriet denied it at once. "No, of course not. It is someone much better." Emma understood at once. Harriet meant Frank Churchill, and she was unhappy because she knew he came from a very good family and could not think of marrying her. "I am not surprised about this, Harriet. The way he saved you was enough to warm your heart. But you are right. You must not hope for too much." "He was wonderful, Miss Woodhouse. When I remember how I felt at the time, and then I saw him coming towards me. Suddenly, I was happy again," said Harriet. "But strange things have happened before, Harriet. You must see how he behaves with you to know how much he really likes you. We made a mistake before because we hoped for too much. This time we will be more careful and not even speak his name," said Emma. Mr. Knightley had never liked Frank Churchill, and as time went on, he disliked him more. He began to think that while Emma seemed to be his special favourite, he also had a liking for Jane Fairfax. Nothing was said to make him think this, but once or twice he had seen a certain look pass between them. Emma was his dear friend, and he knew he must say something to her about it. She did not believe it at all, and was amused by the idea, so he said no more, but it worried him. In June, a trip was arranged by Mrs. Elton to Box Hill, a beautiful place in the countryside. It was going to be a simple party, with only 1 or 2 servants and a picnic. A few days before the trip, one of the Eltons' carriage horses hurt his leg, and they could not go. "Most annoying, Knightley," Mrs. Elton said. "What can we do? The weather is perfect, too." "Come and eat my strawberries. They are ready now, and you do not need horses to travel that distance." He meant it as a joke, but Mrs. Elton thought it was a delightful idea. "Excellent," she said. "I will arrange food and guests. Just name the day." Mr. Knightley certainly did not want her to arrange anything, and said he could do it himself. "Very well. I shall bring Jane and her aunt, and you can ask the other guests. We will walk around your gardens, pick strawberries, and sit under trees, just like a gypsy party. It will be very pleasant." As Emma walked in Mr. Knightley's gardens on the day of the party, she saw him and Harriet standing together away from the others. She was a little surprised, but pleased to find them in conversation. She joined them, and they walked together for a time. Mr. Weston had invited Frank, but by lunchtime he still had not arrived, and Mrs. Weston began to be worried about him. They all had lunch in the house, and then afterwards went into the garden again. Still there was no sign of Frank. Emma stayed in the drawing room with Mr. Woodhouse for a time, because it was too hot for him to be outdoors. She was just walking through the hall when Jane Fairfax suddenly came in through the door. She looked as if she wanted to escape from something, and she was surprised to see Emma. "Will you be so kind," she said, "when they ask about me, to say I have gone home? My aunt does not realize how long we have been here, and I think I should go back to see my grandmother now." It was a long walk to Highbury, and Emma wanted to order her carriage, but Jane did not want this. "I would like to walk," she said as she left. Not long after, Frank arrived. His aunt had been ill again, he said. He was quite annoyed because he had not been at the party, and Jane had already gone home. The Eltons' horse was better, and they had already decided to make their trip to Box Hill the next day. "You must come with us," Emma said to Frank, who was still a little angry. At first, he said he did not want to ride from Richmond again the next day, but then changed his mind and said to her, "If you wish me to join the party, I will." It was a wonderful sunny day for the trip to Box Hill, and it should have been a happy party, but it was not. They separated too much into groups. The Eltons walked together. Mr. Knightley went with Miss Bates and Jane, and Frank looked after Emma and Harriet. Mr. Weston tried all day to make them come together, but he could not. Emma was bored. She had never seen Frank Churchill so silent and stupid. He said very little, and did not seem to listen to anything she said. And Harriet was quiet because he was quiet. When they all sat down together for their picnic lunch, it was better. Frank became much happier and more amusing, and Emma thought he was trying very hard to win her heart. They talked and laughed together, although the rest of the group did not join in. "We are the only people speaking," she whispered to him. "It is silly for us to entertain 7 silent people." "What can we do to make them talk?" whispered Frank. Then he had an idea. "Ladies and gentlemen, I am ordered by Miss Woodhouse to say that you must each say something to entertain her. You can say 1 very clever thing, 2 quite clever things, or 3 very boring things, and she promises to laugh at them all." "Oh, well," said Miss Bates, "then I need not worry. I shall be sure to say 3 very boring things as soon as I open my mouth." Emma could not stop herself. "But there may be a difficulty. You can only say 3 things, no more." Miss Bates did not immediately understand. But when she did, she looked very hurt and embarrassed. The others were all silent. "Ah, yes, I see what she means. I will try not to say more than 3, she said quietly. Mr. and Mrs. Elton stood up and said they did not like games like that, and they were going for a walk. And soon Mr. Knightley, Jane, and her aunt followed them. Frank became louder and more annoying until he began to give Emma a headache. When the servants came to say the carriages were ready, she was quite pleased. As Emma was waiting for her carriage, Mr. Knightley joined her. He looked around to see if they were alone, then said, "Emma, I must speak to you. How could you be so cruel to Miss Bates?" Emma remembered and was sorry, but tried to laugh about it. "It was not so bad, and she probably did not understand me," she said. "She certainly did. You were very rude to her, and you have hurt her. Miss Bates is a very good woman, but you know that she is also rather silly. She is not your equal, Emma. She is not rich and clever like you, and I was ashamed of you for speaking to her like that. And it was worse because you said it in front of other people. Badly done, Emma. Very badly done." Mr. Knightley walked away to his horse, and Emma climbed into her carriage. She felt angry with herself and ashamed. She thought she must say something to Mr. Knightley, and looked back, but he had already gone. The journey home to Hartfield did not make her feel better. Harriet was tired and silent, and as Emma remembered what she had said to Miss Bates, tears ran down her face. Chapter 8. Emma thought about the trip to Box Hill all evening. Maybe the rest of the party had enjoyed it, but she could only think of Miss Bates and how angry Mr. Knightley had been with her. She knew she had been wrong, and she was certain she would never do it again. She decided to call on Miss Bates the next morning. Emma went early, and as she walked into the room, she just had time to see Jane go out of the opposite door. "We are very happy to see you, Miss Woodhouse," Miss Bates said, although Emma thought her voice was not quite as friendly as usual. She asked about Jane. "Poor Poor Jane has an awful headache, she told her. She has been writing letters all morning to the Campbells and to her other friends. We shall be so sad when she goes, but it is a very good opportunity for her, you know. Emma was surprised. Where is Miss Fairfax going? She asked. To a Mrs. Smallridge. 3 delightful little girls to look after. An old friend of Mr. Elton's. Jane will be just like Mrs. Weston was to you and your sister. She finally decided to go yesterday evening, when we were at Mrs. Elton's house. A lovely evening with good friends. And when is she going? Very soon, within a fortnight. My dear mother does not like to think about it, said Miss Bates sadly. Emma stayed a little longer, and then walked home. When she arrived, Mr. Knightley was at Hartfield, and he seemed more serious than usual. I wanted to see you before I went away, Emma. I'm going to London to spend a few days with John and Isabella. I have been thinking about it for some time. Emma thought he looked as if he had not forgiven her. He stood, ready to go, but not going, and Mr. Woodhouse chose that moment to ask her how Mrs. and Miss Bates were. Mr. Knightley suddenly appeared to be pleased with her. He took her hand, and she at first thought he might kiss it, but he let it go again. Then he left immediately. Emma felt happier now that they were friends again. Her father said he had been there for half an hour, and she thought, what a pity I did not come home sooner. The next day brought news from Richmond. Mrs. Churchill, Frank's aunt, had suddenly died. Mr. and Mrs. Weston were shocked, and Emma wondered how Frank's life might change now. Perhaps he would be able to marry Harriet if he wanted to. Emma still hoped for this, but it was too soon to make any plans. Emma's first wish at this time was not for Harriet, but for Jane. She wanted to be a friend to her now, before it was too late and she went away to Mrs. Smallridge. She wrote to her and invited her to come to Hartfield for the day. Jane thanked her for her invitation, but refused. Emma heard that she was not feeling well, and thought an hour or 2 in the countryside might help. So she offered to call in her carriage one day. Jane replied that she was not well enough to go out, but when Harriet said she had seen Jane out walking only that morning, Emma had no doubt. Jane did not want any kindness from her, and she was very, very sorry. One morning, about 10 days after Mrs. Churchill had died, Mr. Weston called at Hartfield and asked Emma to go back to Randalls with him. Mrs. Weston must see you alone, he said. Emma could not guess what might be so urgent, and when they arrived, Mr. Weston left them alone together. Frank has been here this morning, said Mrs. Weston. He came to talk to his father about something. A young lady he is in love with. Emma thought first about herself, then Harriet. Frank and Jane Fairfax have been secretly engaged since they met in Weymouth last October, she said. Emma was very surprised. Jane Fairfax? So, they were engaged before either of them came to Highbury. And nobody knew about it. We are very upset by the way he has behaved, especially to you, Emma. We cannot excuse him for that. You need not worry about me. When we first met, I did think he was very attractive, said Emma, and I thought I was in love with him. But for at least the last 3 months, I have not felt at all like that. Mrs. Weston was much happier then, and called her husband into the room. "It was our wish that you should love each other, and we thought you did. Since this morning we have felt very upset for you," she said. "But he was very wrong. He might have made me love him. And what about Jane? She is going to Mrs. Smallridge now." "He did not know about that, Emma. It was only when he found out that he decided to tell his uncle and then come here," said Mr. Weston. "And Mr. Churchill was happy with the match. While Mrs. Churchill was alive, there was no hope of them marrying, but now they can." "She will be a good wife for him," said Emma. "I congratulate you and them." Emma now had to do a difficult thing. Tell Harriet before she heard about it in Highbury. Harriet had just come home when Emma arrived. "Miss Woodhouse, isn't the news very strange?" "What do you mean? What news?" "About Jane Fairfax and Frank Churchill. They have been secretly engaged, and are now going to be married. I just saw Mr. Weston, and he said you already knew." Harriet certainly did not look upset, and Emma did not understand it. "Did you ever suspect that he loved her?" asked Harriet. "Of course not. I let you hope for him." "Me? I have never hoped for Frank Churchill." "Harriet, what do you mean?" "I know we agreed not to speak his name, but I do not understand how you could have made this mistake. I spoke of someone much better than Frank Churchill." Emma sat down and tried to keep calm. "Let us be very clear, Harriet. I remember you saying how you felt when he saved you from the gypsies. I am certain I did not imagine it." At first, Harriet looked confused. Then she said, "I remember the conversation, but I was thinking of something very different at the time. The night of the ball, when Mr. Elton would not dance with me, and there was no other partner in the room." "Good God!" cried Emma. "You are speaking of Mr. Knightley. This is an awful mistake." Harriet did not think so. "He is kind and sweet to me, and you said yourself, strange things have happened before." Suddenly, Emma realized why it was so much worse now that Harriet was in love with Mr. Knightley and not Frank Churchill. It cut through her like a knife. She would be unhappy if Mr. Knightley married anyone except herself. The rest of the day and the next night, she did not stop thinking about it. How long had she loved Mr. Knightley? How could she be happy now without him? He was coming back to Highbury very soon, and until then Emma decided she and Harriet had better not meet. Mrs. Weston visited Jane Fairfax, and she told Emma about it afterwards. She only decided to go to Mrs. Smallridge because she believed Frank was in love with you, and they could never marry. Now that she has spoken to him again, and the secret is out, she will not go. She said you were very kind to her recently when she was ill," said Mrs. Weston. "I am glad she is happy now, and very sorry if I sometimes hurt her in the past," Emma replied. That evening there was a storm, and it continued all night. Emma sat quietly with her father, and it reminded her of the evening of Mrs. Weston's wedding day. Then Mr. Knightley had walked in soon after tea and made them feel happier, but everything was different now. Mrs. Weston had told Emma she was going to have a baby, so they were probably going to see less of her. Jane and Frank were getting married and might not live in Highbury, and if Mr. Knightley and Harriet married, she would also lose her two dearest friends to each other. There might not be other evenings when Mr. Knightley just walked into Hartfield for the evening. Emma felt very sad, and could not sleep that night. The bad weather continued next morning, but in the afternoon it stopped raining, the sun came out, and it was summer again. Chapter 9. That afternoon, Emma was walking in the garden when she saw Mr. Knightley come through the gate. She did not know he had returned to Highbury, and she was thinking of him and Harriet at exactly that moment. She was beginning to believe he might really love Harriet, and they may perhaps marry one day. They talked about Isabella and John, but Mr. Knightley was quieter than usual. Emma wondered whether he wanted to talk to her about Harriet, but found it difficult to know how to start. She tried to make conversation. "We have some surprising news. A wedding." "Miss Fairfax and Frank Churchill. I have already heard about it," he replied. Emma immediately thought he had been to see Harriet before he came to Hartfield, and she had told him. "How is it possible that you know?" she asked. "Weston wrote to me on business, and he told me the news in his letter," he explained. "You are probably not as surprised as we were. You suspected it before and tried to warn me," Emma sighed. "But I would not listen to you. I seem to have been blind about a lot of things." Nothing was said for a few minutes. Then Mr. Knightley took her hand and pressed it to his heart. "Dear Emma, time will help you forget him," he said, "and he will soon be gone." "You are very kind, but you have misunderstood. I am sorry for things I did and tried to do, but I never loved Frank Churchill, and he did not love me. He was only trying to hide his love for Jane, and I just enjoyed being with him. It was not love," said Emma. There was suddenly a great difference in Mr. Knightley. He held her hand tightly. "Emma, might there be a chance for me?" Emma was so surprised she could not speak. "If your answer is no, please tell me now, Emma. I cannot tell you everything I feel for you. If I loved you less, I might be able to talk about it more," he continued. "But you know what I am. Everything I say to you is true, and I tell you now, my dear, that I have always loved you." Emma had never been happier. She told him then that she loved him too. As they kissed, she thought, just for a moment, of Harriet, and was glad she had not said anything to Mr. Knightley about her. They went into the house and had tea with Mr. Woodhouse, but for the present said nothing to him about their love. After Mr. Knightley had gone, Emma wrote to Isabella and suggested she invited Harriet to London. She thought it would be a good idea if Harriet went away from Highbury for a short time, so they did not see each other for a few weeks. Later that day, Mr. Knightley returned to Hartfield. He wanted to ask Emma to marry him, but he was worried that Mr. Woodhouse would be very upset if Emma left Hartfield and went to live in Mr. Knightley's house. "I could not leave him," said Emma. "We could all live in my house," he suggested. "He would be very unhappy if he had to leave Hartfield," said Emma. "Then there is only one answer," said Mr. Knightley. "We must all live in Hartfield." It was a good idea, and Emma said she would think about it before speaking to her father. The more she thought about it, the more delightful the idea became. The only thing that made her sad was Harriet. If she was still in love with Mr. Knightley, she could not be a part of the happy picture in Emma's mind. Poor Harriet! Emma knew there was going to be a day when she could forget Mr. Knightley, but it was not likely to be soon. It was too much to hope that even Harriet could be in love with more than 3 men in 1 year. Harriet was invited to London as planned, and before Harriet left, Emma wrote to her and explained that she and Mr. Knightley wanted to marry. Mr. Woodhouse's carriage took Harriet to Isabella's house, and after she had gone, Emma felt more comfortable. Now she could enjoy Mr. Knightley's visits without feeling guilty. She was sure that Harriet could find interesting things to do, and there may be people to meet in London to help her forget all that had happened. Emma told her father she and Mr. Knightley were going to get married, and they were all going to live in Hartfield. Mr. Woodhouse did not like changes in his life, and at first he was a little shocked. "We will always be here to look after you, Papa. Nothing will change for you, and you know how much you enjoy talking to Mr. Knightley," she said. Emma talked to him about it a little longer, and he soon saw that they could all be happy together, and it was really quite a good plan. "Perhaps in a year or 2, he said. The news spread quickly, and generally people in Highbury thought it was a very good match, except for Mr. and Mrs. Elton. She had never liked Emma, and thought it was terrible that they would all live together at Hartfield. "It will not work. It is a shocking idea," she said to her husband. He just said, "She probably always meant to catch Knightley if she could." About 2 weeks later, Mr. Knightley called at Hartfield one morning as usual, and told Emma, "I have something to tell you. Some news." "Good or bad?" she asked. "I think it is good, but I am afraid you will not agree with me. It is about Harriet Smith." Emma could not think what had happened to her. "She is going to marry Robert Martin," he said. "Good God! That is impossible so soon. How do you know this?" "Robert Martin told me himself, half an hour ago. You do not like the idea, I can see, but in time you will grow to like him as much as I do," he said. "I am not unhappy at all, just very surprised. Tell me the whole story. How did it happen?" asked Emma. Mr. Knightley told her he had sent Robert to London with a message for John, and at his house he met Harriet again. The family were going out together that evening, and they asked Robert to join them. During the evening he told Harriet he still loved her, and she agreed to marry him, he said. "I hope they will be very happy together," said Emma with a smile. "Have you changed your mind about him?" "I think I have. I hope so, because I was a fool before." "I have also changed my mind about her," said Mr. Knightley. "I used to think she was a silly girl, but the more I talked to her, the more I saw that she is kind and sensible. I sometimes thought you must wonder why I had suddenly started to spend time talking to Harriet," he continued, "but I wanted to get to know her and understand why you liked her so much. They will make a good match." Emma agreed, and was very glad that her friend was now as happy as she was. That afternoon, Emma and her father drove to Randalls. Mrs. Weston was alone in the drawing-room when they arrived, but they had only just sat down when they saw a group of people in the garden. Frank arrived here this morning, and he has just come back in the carriage with Miss Fairfax, her aunt, and her grandmother. They are coming in now," Mrs. Weston said. The little group came into the drawing-room with Mr. Weston, and Emma was very pleased to see Frank and Jane again. While the rest of the party talked together, Frank said to Emma, "I am surprised you did not suspect us. Once I nearly told you, but I changed my mind. I hope you can forgive me for the way I behaved to you. I know I was wrong, and I only did it because I could see you had no thoughts of marriage." "There is nothing to forgive," she said. "I also behaved badly." "I am delighted to see you again," he said, "and also to hear that you and Mr. Knightley are engaged. You will be very happy, I am sure of it." The next day, Harriet arrived back in Highbury, and called on Emma immediately. She told her she felt a little foolish now when she thought of Mr. Knightley, and Emma was pleased to see that she loved Mr. Martin very much. Very soon, Robert Martin was invited to Hartfield, and Emma saw that Mr. Knightley had been right about him. He was polite and kind, and she had no doubt that Harriet was always going to be happy in his home, surrounded by people who loved her. Before the end of September, Harriet and Robert Martin were married in Highbury Church by Mr. Elton, the last of the 3 couples to get engaged and the first to be married. Jane Fairfax and Frank Churchill had planned their wedding for November, and Emma and Mr. Knightley thought October was a good time for theirs. Isabella and John were going to be staying at Hartfield at that time, and they could look after Mr. Woodhouse while the couple went away to the sea for a fortnight. The only problem was making Emma's father agree with them that October was a good time for the wedding. Mr. Woodhouse thought it was too soon, and suggested they wait a little longer, but something happened to change his mind. Mrs. Weston's chickens were all stolen from the chicken house one night, and the same thing happened to other people in Highbury. Mr. Woodhouse was very worried about this. He said he would be nervous in his house after John and Isabella had gone back to London if there was no other man at Hartfield to look after him. John had to return to London by the end of the first week in November, so it was finally agreed that the wedding must be arranged for October. Emma and Mr. Knightley's wedding was a simple one. Mrs. Elton had not been invited, and so her husband described it to her. She thought it sounded very plain, and was nothing compared to her own wedding. But the small group of true friends who were invited were delighted by it, and Emma and Mr. Knightley were perfectly and completely happy.